Good evening. This is Dispatch Live. I'm Kevin Williamson. I'm here with Esther Eaton. Grayson Logue will be on in a little while, and the political guys at the end. We have a lot of stuff to cover tonight, a whole bunch of different topics. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, so thank you all for joining us. But first, Esther, I kind of have a little bit of a bone to pick with you because, one of the things we do with the Dispatch is we're not about clickbait. We're not about hot takes and, overblown rage-driven commentary on sexy topics of the day. And I'm just not down with your pandering with these pieces about insurance economics, which is just really a way to try to sell subscriptions, I'm pretty sure. Okay, we'll turn off the sarcasm dial there. What the heck's going on with the insurance business in California and Florida? Why are the companies pulling out?
Yeah, the short version of what's going on is nothing good. And the story of why in each place is a little different. But I mean, if you really wanted to boil it down and say what they have in common, it's the environment, as well as some bad policy making. But for California, I don't know if you've heard, they've had some trouble with wildfires. For Florida, they've had some hurricanes coming through. And shockingly, insurers don't like those things. And that makes them want to raise prices. And if they don't have the freedom to do that as much as they want to, they sometimes decide it's better not to do business there at all. So we've had a few major insurers leave those states. And then what's grabbed less attention, but is sort of equally unfortunate for the homeowners there, is that a bunch of small state-based ones have just gone out of business altogether.
So wildfires and hurricanes aren't new, really. These things have been going on for a while. I understand with recent changes in climate and whatnot, we're seeing probably some more of those and in greater degree of severity. Is it the events that's really driving the economics here, or is it policy, or what's the balance between those two things, and what's the policy end of it look like?
Well, like I say, it is definitely a bit of both. You're exactly right that it's not like suddenly for the first time Florida has hurricanes, but it's definitely true that they've had a few bad ones in recent years, and it's not that unusual for insurance companies to kind of take a mini step back and then return over time. But right now, a lot of them are stepping back because they've had some worse hurricanes. Similarly, in California, we've had a couple of bad wildfire years. But in terms of policy, that's something that I guess can also be an evergreen problem. But in Florida, one of the big things more recently that insurance companies have been complaining about is just how easy it is to sue them and how expensive that is for them. And Florida has been trying to address this. DeSantis, he signed a couple laws and said, all right, we've been a hellhole of litigation long enough, time to make some change. And some of the changes that they made there are just, again, basically protecting the insurers from these lawsuits. So something that was very common in Florida was these sort of roof insurance scams. So roof contractors would go around, they would spot some damage on someone's roof. They would say, hey, let us fix this for you. And if you sign over the ability to make a claim against your insurance company, we will make that claim and get it paid for. Everything's going to be great. The insurance company would then send in their own guy to see how much damage there actually was. They would say there's less than this roofing contractor has said, so we're going to give you a smaller amount of money. But then the roofing company says, great, we're going to sue over this and try to get more money from you. And then the insurance company could either decide to settle or to fight this, but either way, it's expensive. And because this was easier to do in Florida than in other places, and because if the plaintiff won, they could get their attorney fees paid for, it's just caused just this flood of litigation for these companies. And I want to say Florida has something like 10% of the country's home insurance claims, but has closer to 80% of its home insurance lawsuits. So just was super out of whack. And the companies didn't like this. And they said, you need to change this. So they did. They tried to fix some of that by making that harder to do. But it's going to take some time to see whether that really works, because the laws that they put in place aren't retroactive. Claims that were filed before these laws passed those lawsuits can still happen. And something like more than 100,000 lawsuits were filed between, the bill being brought up and it being signed into law. So there's a huge deluge. Yeah, to go through.
So it's HB 837. Is that the tort reform package? What's actually in that?
So some of those rules about making it harder, blocking a homeowner's ability to sign over this right to seek their claims so that the roofing companies in particular can't do that kind of thing anymore. Also removing that ability for plaintiffs to get their attorney fees paid for if they win. There are some concerns about those steps because they are pretty friendly to insurance companies and they make it harder for people to, if you're Joe Schmo homeowner and you go to court to try to get, justice, maybe you can't afford it to do that anymore because you won't get those attorney fees paid for even if you win. So there are concerns about some of the ways that could backfire, but it is something that the insurance companies have been asking for. And since like 10 of them have gone belly up in the past couple of years, Florida can't prevent all hurricanes, but this was something that they could do.
Florida, apparently, I didn't know this, has a guy whose job title is Chief Financial Officer of the state. Petronas, is that his name? Jimmy, what is it? Yeah, it's Petronas. Jimmy Petronas is his name. And he's been giving these kind of buffoonish remarks about, the insurance companies are the new Bud Light and they're leaving Florida because they're woke and don't like our policies and things like that. Is that as baseless as it sounds to me?
It is pretty baseless. I think, he didn't offer a lot of concrete detail of what he meant by that vibes-based statement. But it is true that, like your average private company, these guys are pretty driven by their bottom line. And when you have 10 of them failing and a bunch on solvency watch lists for the state, it's clear that there's some genuine financial distress going on. Yeah. He would say that that's because they've made bad decisions and now they're leaving Florida homeowners stuck to deal with the results of that. Here nor there, but these companies haven't cited Florida, being too much of a conservative bastion of, Ron DeSantis winning at life. That's not the reason that they say they're leaving. They say they're leaving because the storm risk has gone up and they haven't been able to raise prices enough to account for that, and because of these lawsuits.
In Florida, and if you're Donald Trump, you've got to be thankful for this. Florida is famous for having crazy juries who just make, sort of wild decisions from time to time. And they're typically very pro-plaintiff juries in cases of people suing businesses. So partly you've got a cultural thing there, I suppose. It's kind of interesting to me that you've got this going on in Florida, which is seen as a very conservative state, or at least a very conservatively governed state. You've also got it going on in California, which is sort of the leftiest state, or at least the leftiest of the big states, which suggests to me that you've got something that is happening where the forces outside of the policymaking world are a lot more powerful than the forces inside the policymaking world. And we have a tendency sometime to speak and act as though all these problems were the result of political decisions. When in fact, it's really more the opposite. The political decisions are often trying to catch up with realities on the ground. In this case, realities literally on the ground in the form of large piles of water or smoking wrecks where there used to be forests and such things.
And the good problem to have of people wanting to live in those states. So they just have a lot more people moving into these risky flood and fire zones and consequently having claims to make when disasters strike.
Yeah, you're not seeing a lot of these stories about, I guess, like South Dakota, really, probably because, it's just...
Snow isn't a big thing. You are seeing them, I will say, in places like Louisiana, where they don't have, the influx of population the same way that, say, Florida does, but they do have some of the hurricane problems. These aren't, Florida and California are the ones grabbing headlines, but a lot of states have similar problems. And as far as the policy angle is concerned, sometimes it does really come down to just states don't want it to be as expensive to live there as it ought to be if the actual risks of these extreme events get priced in. And so they find ways to subsidize that and to block insurance companies from adjusting prices accordingly. And that does have consequences where the insurance companies just decide to leave.
Yeah, Texas did a big tort reform thing about, I guess it's going on 20 years ago now. And at the time it was put through, it mainly was targeted at medical malpractice, things like that. And there was the usual shrieking of, well, no one will ever be able to, make a company pay for any sort of malfeasance or anything like that. And none of that seems to have made much of a difference on that front, although it is a lot harder to sue people in Texas, and that has made it a more attractive place for people to do business of various kinds. There's a doctor I talked to in Philadelphia. I remember he was talking about moving to Georgia, and he was going to take a $200,000 pay cut, but he'd end up making $100,000 more after his $200,000 pay cut because his liability insurance would be so much less expensive in Georgia than it was in Philadelphia, which also has crazy jurors. But as I recall, in the Texas tort reform stuff, I may be wrong about that, but they adopted loser pays as part of their tort reform, whereas you're telling me in Florida they've gotten rid of loser pays as a means of discouraging lawsuits. That seems to me kind of strange and interesting.
Yeah, that's I wasn't familiar with Texas making that change 20 years ago, but that is kind of interesting that they're going opposite ways, ostensibly with the same goal in mind. I guess I'll be curious to see how that plays out in Florida. It could be that it'll backfire, but again, I think it is a response to the specific circumstances they had of sort of all these fraudulent lawsuits. And so they want to disincentivize those. We'll see whether that works as planned. Someone pointed this out in the chat, and I think it's a good point that I haven't touched on yet, which is just another reason that some of these issues for insurance companies are happening now is that pandemic-related supply chain and other disruptions increased the cost of construction quite a bit. And so again, the cost of payouts for these disastrous events went up sort of faster than they could adjust. Similarly, reinsurance companies, which offer basically insurance for the insurers. So normally an insurance company just has to pay out, a few policies at a time. Different people have different things happening. But when there's a huge event, that's a lot of policy payouts at once. And so they have reinsurance to ensure that their pool of money is big enough to handle that. And those guys also can raise prices very quickly. That tends to be very volatile. And they will do that after a major event. And so once again, insurance companies who maybe can't raise them quite as quickly are left sort of making up that sudden gap.
And they can't raise the prices quickly because there's regulatory controls on premium increases. Is that it?
Regulatory controls, yes. And of course, just, sometimes there are constraints on how quickly you can raise prices on your customers before they freak out.
Yeah. I don't want to make everything about presidential politics, which I think is a very bad habit that we tend to have in a lot of our discussions. But if I'm Ron DeSantis, I probably want to get some kind of tort reform signed pretty quickly, because if you're running for the Republican nomination, you don't want to hear Florida and California together, like having the same set of problems, even though there's reasons for them to have the same set of problems outside of who the governor is and what party he belongs to and all that. Was there a sense that this was being expedited for political reasons? Excuse me.
I think this is something that insurers have been complaining about for several years. I think that they knew they were having insurance companies go belly up in the last couple of years. And after Hurricane Ian, I think that's the right name, which was their most expensive one ever, sort of that turbocharged this problem. Not being super familiar with the dynamics for DeSantis's team, I honestly can't say whether the presidential election influenced that, but I do think you're absolutely right that naturally they don't want to be put into the same bucket of problems with California while they're trying to draw a hard, bright line between them.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts on this before we move on to Grayson?
Yeah, if you want cheap home insurance, I would advise not moving to Florida for the foreseeable future.
Where has cheap home insurance? Places people don't want to live, I assume, mostly, or
pretty much. Yeah. Or places that are very safe. So, just move to Maine. We never have hurricanes.
What kind of problems? Maine has problems, though. I'm trying to think of what it must be, though. You've got Canadian wildfires up there blowing smoke all over you.
That's true. Although the rest of the country is far from safe from that. Yeah, I mean, we have the problem of our young people moving away, and I'm a case in point on that one. I say we, but I no longer live there. So we got problems of our own, but hurricanes aren't one of them, is the important point here.
Right. It's just bears. All right. Well, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you next time. Grayson, are you ready to come in and join the conversation?
Hello there.
Hey, what's up?
Nothing much. Can't complain.
You've been hitting on a whole bunch of sort of different and largely unrelated topics recently. You got the AI deepfake political ads, stuff about Wuhan lab funding, and the passport business. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'm tempted to go just into passport processing because I think that's might rival insurance as a sexy topic. But maybe we start with the AI political ads and the problem of deepfakes.
All right. As much as we like to talk about bureaucratic malfunction here, well, one thing about that story that does drive me nuts. So apparently, while the whole federal government was spending $1 gazillion to keep people on the payroll everywhere else, they laid off all the passport people as though the pandemic were never going to be over and people were going to start traveling and applying for passports again. And now they're trying to hire them back, which is silly. All right, AI. Going to do your job one of these days. I'm pretty sure, maybe not mine, but probably yours. And no, just kidding. Tell me about the story.
Yeah, well, it was really an exploration of what are the potential consequences for generative AI, for deepfake technology on political races, in particular, looking into the heat of the 2024 race. A few years ago, deepfakes or kind of those fun videos on the internet of someone impersonating Tom Cruise or an AI Morgan Freeman, or my personal favorite of Bill Hader on an old Letterman interview doing impressions of different actors with the deepfake overlaid over his face of like Al Pacino and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But with it seemingly, yeah, it's great. I would recommend it to anybody if you want 2 minutes of some fun. But with just about anything on the internet, it seems like we can't have nice things. As soon as like a fun new trick comes out, the most nefarious thing you can imagine is what it's used for. And I mean, politics is a piece of that. I'd say the most nefarious is all of the deep fakes as it relates to pornography. There's all these horrible apps where you can post upload an image of a person who's dressed and it will give you like an AI generated version of them nude. That's a whole kind of dark web issue of its own. But the point is, in the last like probably 12 to 16 months, the entry barriers for someone to be able to create a deep fake realistically impersonating someone else have come really, really down far. Like basically the costs are near zero with some of these new AI tools that have kind of been released for open public use. One being the DALL-E, which is an image generator, which is again released some humorous results online, but now campaigns, we're seeing the early steps of people starting to use this technology in the political sphere, and regulators are trying to catch back up to how do we actually think about deepfakes in particular at people, quote unquote, impersonating candidates in political advertisements and the ramifications of that. So earlier this year, when Joe Biden announced his re-election campaign in April, the Republican National Commission released an entirely AI-built ad coming out against Biden's candidacy. It kind of displayed all these post-apocalyptic scenarios of, I think China was invading Taiwan and there was war happening. And it was entirely generated using AI, which was kind of a groundbreaking thing for a major political institution like the RNC to do.
What was the AI end of that? I mean, you hardly need to have an artificial intelligence system to come up with an ad that says, hey, maybe China's going to invade Taiwan. Yeah, organic stupidity, we'll cover that.
Yeah, it was mainly the fact that it was using that technology to create relatively, they looked a little animated, but not too animated scenes of this essentially happening. So
just the visuals then.
Yes, just the visuals. That's correct. And it wasn't a video impersonating Joe Biden saying something that he hadn't said, but there was an AI generated image of him smiling with Kamala Harris in some of these scenes signifying their re-election for the purpose of the ad. And so a number of groups are concerned as these tools get more powerful, are there ways in which federal regulators, such as the Federal Election Commission, can actually apply some rules here to ensure that people aren't misled by deepfakes to think that candidates are saying things and doing things that they actually aren't.
Right. If anyone, Joe Biden is going to be safe from this stuff, though, because as I understand it, generative AI is probability driven, whereas Joe Biden's speech is entirely erratic and unpredictable. So it'd be really hard, I think, to come up with it's like the problem of generating truly random numbers. It's apparently a really hard computing problem. Generating truly randomness on the Joe Biden level, I think would be difficult. So what we're worried about in the future, I suppose, is two things: is political ads, I suspect, will all just come to take with a grain of salt. And when there's an ad that comes out and, here's Joe Biden saying he hates Jews and wants to boil puppies and would like to crucify Jesus again if he got the chance. I think people will kind of look at that and go, we've got this tool now and that can be done the same way that, photographic evidence stopped being considered dispositive in court, 100 years ago, because you could fake pictures. But what I worry about is AI generated fake news, which is a different thing. And you've got, two sets of problems there. One is that it's easy to generate fake journalism. I mean, we do it without AI all the time. Not we, but other people do it without access to sophisticated technological tools all the time. And so you can really flood the zone with the fake stuff. But the other thing, and this is really the problem we've run into with the way social media has shaped our political discourse, is that people willingly suspend their critical thinking abilities on this stuff because there's a very strong incentive to want to believe the worst about people you hate. So, if you come out and say, well, Hillary Clinton is running a child molestation ring out of a pizza shop somewhere in Washington, it's absurd on the face of it, but you can get hundreds of thousands of people to believe it because they want to believe it. So these AI tools will take what's already an existing real psychological problem that has political consequences and kind of turbocharge it. So it's like, building a better gun, essentially. You had problems with violence before, but now you've got a more efficient way of doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that kind of goes back to when the cost is near zero or essentially zero to just churn this stuff out, you really erode flooding the zone. Steve Bannon famously said, you really erode people's ability to kind of trust what they're seeing. I will say outside the ad realm, we've seen some little glimpses of some geopolitical consequences when it comes to deepfake. Specifically, back in March of last year, there was a deepfake of Zelensky announcing that he had surrendered, that hackers posted on a Ukrainian news site. Again, it was kind of debunked pretty quickly, but that's to get close to something like that actually having effects on Ukrainians' military activity or people thinking the war is actually over, even if for a moment, those can have significant consequences. In May, there was an AI generated image, or likely AI generated image, of an explosion at the Pentagon that caused like a brief but still registered a dip in the stock market. So there's all these different permutations of people who could take advantage of this for political reasons, for financial reasons, and I think we're behind the curve, it's safe to say, on figuring out how to navigate these, both from a government perspective, but just an information environment perspective also.
Yeah, everyone knows the famous story of the War of the Worlds broadcast, where people were panicked and thought the country was actually being invaded by aliens. But as it turns out, there were like 60 similar episodes over the course of about 50 years in which there were various kinds of entertainments and things that came out that people thought were actually happening. So it's something that we've got that button in it that's pretty easy to push. So assuming it's not a solvable problem, because problems normally aren't solvable, that is manageable, how do we raise the cost of this? I don't mean the actual financial cost of producing this stuff, but the political cost of doing so. How do we make it something that is so reputationally damaging to engage in that political campaigns at least want to stay away from it? I mean, other people obviously will have their reasons.
Yeah, that's a challenge, given that I feel like there are very few things that you can do in politics these days that actually harm your reputation. I will say that some of the DeSantis campaign's early efforts at doing this have faced some pretty significant, fairly significant cries of opposition from Trump-aligned figures in the Republican Party and the media ecosystem, figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene or J.D. Vance. They've come out against the Ron DeSantis campaign ad and Super PAC ad that have kind of relied on deepfake technology, one to show a false image of Trump hugging Fauci, another to use a voice generator to read something that Trump didn't actually say but posted online. It was, his critique of Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, and they were playing that as an ad in Iowa to say, why is Trump bashing your favorite governor, essentially, to Iowa Republican voters.
You just get that guy from Saturday Night Live to read it, who does Trump's voice very well.
Yeah, there you go. So that, I think, is a pretty, you can see the political reasons why people are doing that. I don't think that those figures would be coming out for at least not as ardently against ads that were impersonating Joe Biden in the future. So I'm not sure how we make that politically too costly for folks to engage in. Part of the problem is candidates can hide behind their super PACs. So the existing Federal Election Commission rules don't apply about impersonating candidates. They don't apply to super PACs anyway. So videos created by an outside group or even amplified by a super PAC are a way to create some insulation from this as a political figure in this new world.
We have a couple minutes left. You want to talk Wuhan? You want to talk passports?
I'll leave it to you. What are you feeling?
Well, the Wuhan thing is kind of interesting to me in the sense that, like everything else in our politics, it's this discussion has become hostage to this weird, political polarization. So the idea that the coronavirus came out of a Wuhan viral laboratory has become sort of branded a right-wing idea, and the sort of official account, if you want to call it that, is become branded progressive idea, and to give favor or support to one side of that is seen as a kind of inherently right-wing thing to do. So Biden, of course, is if those you haven't seen the story, has prohibited new funding for anything going to that particular laboratory, which, given the weirdness of the politics there, seems like he's doing something that it's not a conservative thing to do necessarily, but it's the kind of thing that would please certain people who watch Fox News and listen to a lot of AM radio. Now, the Wuhan lab leak theory has the added benefit of probably being true. So, I mean, that's my particular point of view. Your mileage may vary. But what was with the timing of that? Why was that decision made, do you think? And are there going to be any consequences? I haven't really heard a lot of people talking about it very much outside of just the straight news reporting on it.
Yeah, from the practical effects side of things, it was largely symbolic in the sense that the Institute hasn't received any new funding since 2020, that was cut off pretty quickly. But it was prompted, I think, at least in part by the HHS OIG report that was released in January, showing that both the NIH and Eco Health Alliance, which is the organization that is that funneled the sub grants from the NIH to the lab in Wuhan, did a really poor job of actually overseeing how that grant money was spent to ensure that there was compliance with the restrictions and the requirements for that grant money. A lot of that was the product of the fact that the WIV, Wuhan Institute of Virology, wasn't really sharing very much with Eco Health Alliance. But that could be one of the actual consequences here, is it builds more momentum for a push to defund any government funding and level a similar department for Eco Health Alliance, which is this public health research organization that does research in a lot of different countries, receives significant funding. I think it's something on the order of $46 million they've received from the Department of Defense to do public health research across the globe. So if that actually goes through, if the momentum builds for that funding to be cut, that will be a significant result of this decision. But for now, it's a little bit like closing a chapter when it comes to WIV, at least in terms of the explicit United States ties. So we'll see what happens next.
And forgive me if I sound like I'm being facetious here, but I'm not. Is $46 million a lot of money in the world of public health funding?
Aggregately, I think the Gates Foundation probably beats that. But for Eco Health Alliance, that was a significant. I'm blanking on if it was a majority of their total funding, but the United States DoD funding was certainly a significant portion of their annual revenue. Gotcha.
So, is there any political bounce coming out of this? Or people talking about it very much? Are you seeing anything? Or
well, the folks that have been pushing on this issue are basically saying that this is too little, too late. This should have been done 3 years ago. So Biden's certainly not getting any boost from the Republican lawmakers in the House and the Senate, obviously, who've been pushing on this issue. But I'll just reiterate that I think whether or not Eco Health Alliance, especially as the NDAA authorization is going forward, whether or not there's an attachment that actually gets included will, I think, demonstrate the legs of this, politically speaking.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Do we have our other two panelists here yet? I don't see them in the setup. If they're not here yet, we can, there's Mike Warren, and we can talk about passports, or we can talk about the bar behind me, which apparently a lot of people want to talk about. I am visiting a friend right now. He's a friend who entertains a lot. And that's that. Not my own personal home bar, which does not look anything like this.
We want bar talk.
We want bar talk. Thank you, Grayson. We'll talk to you soon. Hey, guys.
Hey, how's
Kevin.
it going?
What is new?
Drucker?
Just another day at the office.
Yeah. Let's start with you, Mike, because question we were talking about a little bit before, which I think is a good one to start with, which is something that people maybe don't think about that much. The Trump legal stuff obviously has been an issue on the Republican side of the fence, not as much as you would expect it to be. I won't do my whole thing about going back into the past and talking about Donald Trump being indicted and no one being surprised by that, but being surprised by the fact that he's the former president. But this matters on the Democratic
Not surprised
side.
by the last one or the next one.
Pardon me?
Not surprised by the last one or the next one.
Oh, the indictments, you mean?
No,
Yeah.
he's not. Yeah, people won't be surprised to hear.
No,
that
no one's
he's
ever going to
been
be surprised
indicted.
about Donald Trump being indicted on anything. I mean, he's got an indictable face. You know, he's this guy who looks like he gets indicted twice a day. But how are the Democrats handling this? What are they doing with the issue? Is it having much of an effect on their internal political dynamics? Obviously, there are people who get up every morning and they do a Google News search for the walls are closing in, which they've been doing for the last however many years. And the walls never seem to quite get there. But I've teed you up. Tell me about it.
Well, Kevin, we have been focused so much on the Republicans because that's where all the action is on the presidential side of things. But I started to wonder, and I started to ask this question of Democrats, and I'm not talking about, the rabid MSNBC watchers who are tweeting or blue skying or whatever the social media thing is at the moment for those kind of MSNBC watchers. But what about Democrats whose job it is to think about how their party can win campaigns? And obviously the most important one coming up is how President Joe Biden can win re-election. Obviously the Biden folks have been quiet. There's actually not much of a campaign, right, Drucker? I mean, there's only a few people who are actually staffers on the Joe Biden campaign. There'll be some more as we get closer, but understandably, the Biden White House doesn't really want to talk a lot about these federal indictments. There's this idea that if the Biden administration's Justice Department is prosecuting Donald Trump, or really anybody, but in this particular case, Donald Trump, the likely Republican nominee, maybe the president shouldn't be talking about it. Maybe they shouldn't be talking about it from the White House. So they're actually doing a fairly good job of sticking to that. But I want to talk to other
You think
Democrats.
that, pardon me for interrupting. You think by talking about it, they would give oxygen to the complaint that this is a political persecution of some kind?
Well, look, Donald Trump and his allies are going to say that no matter what. And,
Sure.
So I think Democrats recognize that, and that there's no reason to throw more fuel on the fire. If you have plausible deniability, and look, I mean, we know, and I did a little reporting on this, that particularly in the second half of the Trump administration, there was quite a bit of influence and maybe even interference or conversations happening between the White House and the Justice Department, but that's typically not what happens. That's not what is happening in the Biden administration. But I did want to talk to, again, campaign operative types. What's the mood? What's the conversation going on about this very odd and unique likelihood that Donald Trump will face trial starting on May 20th, 2024, right at the end of the Republican primary cycle, if he is the nominee, he and Republicans will be gearing up for the Republican convention in a couple of months. And Donald Trump's trial in this documents case might be starting then on May 20th. The judge Eileen Cannon in the Southern District of Florida basically made that decision. That date could change. But if we accept that as the likely start date or a possible start date, I wanted to know what Democrats thought about how to deal with that. There's sort of an interesting question of how do you run against a guy who is being prosecuted? I started asking questions about what if he stands outside the courthouse every single day, and then when the court adjourns, he holds a rally. How do you deal with that? Do you counter program? Do you have to kind of have Biden surrogates reiterate, hey, look, this guy has been indicted, he's on trial? And the response—
Suddenly there's a lot of demand for veterans of Pakistani political campaigns.
But, I was surprised at the Democrats I've spoken with so far that they have this kind of view that, we're going to let the trial happen. Maybe the trial won't happen until after 2024. Maybe it will start on May 20th, 2024. Either way, we think, and this is Democrats speaking, they think it's a good issue for them politically to step away, to sort of let Donald Trump sort of get in his own way. They recognize that Republicans are really flocking to Trump in a sort of defense and almost circling the wagons around him as he faces these indictments and prosecutions. They view this as a loser with independent swing voters, and they think there's no benefit, there's no upside in doing really much of anything. They want to say that Joe Biden is running the country. He's doing a pretty good job. The economy's doing well. And by the way, he's not the other crazy guy. That's really seems to be what their approach is. It's not that different from their approach in 2020. And it's striking to me that the mood so far among Democrats is to have restraint. We'll see if that lasts. We'll see if, say, super PACs don't get in the game a little bit. Democratic super PACs get in the game and try to tear them down when we get to that point. But at the moment, the mood is kind of about restraint and holding back.
Now, I always like to remind people that, Joe Biden's run for president, 5 or 6 times? And
this will be his 4th time.
And the only person who ever lost to him was Donald Trump.
That's right.
Ron DeSantis not having the greatest week.
No, Ron DeSantis is busy retooling his campaign. I spoke to a campaign aide this evening, and look, they're being quite candid, and we saw in the news reports all day. They're being quite candid that they were top heavy, staff had to go. They need to run a slimmer operation, and it's a good line, Kevin, but it's also true. They're recognizing that they're not the front runner, and therefore they cannot run a campaign like they're the front runner. The issue with them is not that they're not raising enough money; it's that they're not raising enough money to support the leading campaign that they had envisioned. So they're saying all the right things about running as an insurgent and an outsider and recapturing that fighting spirit that candidate Ron DeSantis had when he first ran for Congress and for governor and things like that. But it has the benefit of being true in that he's in a solid second place for now, in my estimation, no matter what some of these polls say. But it's also true that he is running from behind, and that's kind of the attitude he's going to need if he's going to eventually get to the top.
I want to know what you mean by solid second place. Is it because he's so far ahead of 3rd place? Because he's not that close to 1st.
Correct, but I don't say because of that. I just say because nobody's really caught him in 2nd. There is some space between him and 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And he's dipped here and there. And look, maybe he's going to dip more over the next 10 days and things will be different. but he's pretty much been stuck in second place in most polls, anywhere from 18 to 22, sometimes as low as 16, sometimes as high as 24. I know some polling has shown him recently tied with Vivek Ramaswamy. I just think that's an outlier. Now, when you're in second place and you're down by 20 or 30, I don't know that you write home about that and wait, I don't know how much convincing of donors you're going to do, but that everything's fine. But I still think that he is separated from the rest of the pack.
Yeah.
His issue is that instead of trailing by even, let's say, 10 or 12, he's trailing by 22 or 32 or 40. Yeah. And that's the problem.
So this to me, and again, I'm not as well tuned into these things as you are, but this doesn't feel like the John McCain down to my nephew carrying my own bags through the airport before finally turning things around and ending up getting the nomination, which those kinds of episodes have a kind of sort of ritual inevitability to them. This seems to me like a guy who's actually just not doing it.
Well, a couple of
things. Am I premature in my judgment?
Well, you might be premature, you might not. I mean, maybe, somebody's going to, I always like, Mike hears me say this like 10 times a day, but every year somebody goes to Vegas and they put money on their favorite team to win the title. And they have all these reasons why their favorite team is going to win the title. And every once in a while, their favorite team wins the title and they're, see, I told you, and I knew it because of this and that, but really they didn't know anything. I mean, they were all just like, they believed in their team and they thought they were right, but they didn't know. They got lucky. Now you're a little smarter than that. So, you've been doing this a while, so you're on the right track. What, for a potential outcome, what I would say is that, number one, John McCain was the Donald Trump of his race. And then it all went south. Meaning he was the front runner. He was the guy that was supposed to win. And he was a very substantial national figure who had run for president once before and then paid his dues in the party. The whole thing falls apart. I remember, we all kept saying, how can he continue? How can he go on? And he didn't just slim down his campaign to the nuts and bolts and studs. I mean, here's a United States senator, extremely well known by that point, who's, flying Southwest or whatever the cattle call airline was at the time, and just, running around New Hampshire holding town hall meetings. And that's all he was doing. Ron DeSantis, number one, has slimmed down, but he's still maintaining, in my view, somewhat of a substantial campaign. Number two, he is the governor of a state and he's based in Tallahassee. I know some people have criticized him for not deciding to fly Southwest and do the same thing. But when you're the governor of a state, you have certain security protocols. And because he's based in Tallahassee, it's not easy. Look, I've flown in and out of Tallahassee. Nothing wrong with the airport there. Fun college town, I'm sure. But you can't just catch a flight to Manchester, Des Moines, and even, Columbia, South Carolina at will, right? It'd be easier if he was based in Washington, the way McCain was at the time. It'd be easier if he was based in Miami or Tampa or Orlando, for God's sakes. But he's not, because he still has to run a state, because if he doesn't, that's going to look bad too. So he's got some issues he's got to deal with.
So
also, he's trying to
go
go
their campaign headquarters in Dallas, Atlanta, or Chicago.
Or if you run it, well, here's the thing though. I mean, Vegas, he could have run he could have run his campaign out of his hometown of Tampa, Florida. He's from suburban Tampa, but it wouldn't change the fact that he's governor of Florida right now and can't be a complete absentee landlord from Tallahassee. The other thing is, unlike McCain, McCain was the original front runner in that race. Ron DeSantis was hoping to be, but is not. And I think the mistake they made is they launched a campaign based on him being a front runner once he got in, or the front runner, and it never materialized. And then Donald Trump gets indicted, which of course his numbers are going to go up because, everybody who gets indicted, Kevin, when you're accused of serious crimes, of abusing your office, among other things, naturally your numbers go up. And Ron DeSantis should have known this, and he should have totally prepared for Donald Trump's legal problems to even create a greater gulf between him and the actual front runner. And somebody ought to look into that campaign and figure out why they didn't know better. So now that they understand what the lay of the land is, They've slimmed down some. They're recalibrating their message, something I didn't actually think they were doing, but they are doing in a sort of way.
How so?
And now we'll just see if it works. Well, as it was explained to me, so much of what Ron DeSantis has been doing is talking about his proposed agenda for the presidency in terms of what he did in Florida. Everything was about, I did this in Florida, I'll do this in Washington. And I think they've concluded that, and by the way, I don't know that this is necessarily a problem, but they have concluded that they need to talk about his agenda in a very forward way that sort of separates this talk of did it here, I'll do it there. That it's just, here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to put it in the context of being the president rather than the context of being governor. Now, I always thought, hey, it seems like a good selling point because, if you're a voter in Iowa, it's not just what he's promising he'll do, it's promising he'll do what he did. And there's a lot of currency in that. But they've concluded that they need to start talking about these things in a sort of, this is about the presidency, not about my service as governor. And so that'll be interesting to see if that solves any problem. I mean, I think, one of the things that they need to do is just get him out there and get him out there in front of voters more often. If I can level one critique and create a parallel with what McCain did, McCain basically lived in New Hampshire, and it's not that he lived in New Hampshire that I'm suggesting was the solution. Really what he did was he lived with voters and he just lived with them. And I think Ron DeSantis should be on the trail, if possible, 3 to 4 days a week with multiple events every single day. He's going to have to take time to raise money. He's going to have to be in Tallahassee once in a while. Every single weekend, 2 or 3 days during the week, I think he needs to be out there over and over again. And finally, and this is not rocket science, you don't need me for this, this debate is big for everybody. It's particularly big for him. And that's in part because this snowball of bad news or tough stories creates a problematic momentum in and of itself. Sometimes voters, they don't even know it's not that they're not smart enough. They're very smart, but they don't know what's going on because they have regular lives and they're not paid to do all this stuff. And then it's like, there's a story about, some candidate and it's like a bad story. Oh, I don't even know. Who cares? Then there's another one. Then there's another one. And it's like, man, maybe there's a problem. There's so many stories. What's the problem? I don't know, but it must be a problem because everybody's saying there's a problem. Gee, there's a problem. Maybe I'll look for somebody else. Years ago, I remember when I was covering Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in Sacramento, he was running some ballot initiatives, and the opposition was running ads against it, and something had to do with pensions for public officials, for the firefighters and the cops and everything. My father calls me one day and he's like, does the governor not like firemen? I'm like, I don't know. I've seen all these ads. It's not that he had really concluded for himself, but he saw all of the ads and is like, oh, maybe there is a problem, because that's what a normal person does that actually has a job that produces something tangible and useful for society versus all the stuff we do. So we'll see, but it's going to be a very important 4 or 5 weeks for him.
I had a job once. It was a terrible experience.
Yeah.
Same here. What do you think I'm doing this?
Yeah. Fill me in on something real quick, because I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. DeSantis's pole position in Iowa, DeSantis's pole position in New Hampshire. Better than where he is nationally, worse than where he is nationally, right about the same?
It's right about the same.
Okay. So no reason to think there's any indication of any big surprises in any of those early states, at least from where we're sitting now.
Well, I'd love to see an Ann Selzer poll in Iowa to tell me if, something different. The New Hampshire polling's pretty solid. Look, the one thing you can say about DeSantis is he's been endorsed by a lot of state legislators in New Hampshire and in Iowa. That can matter quite a bit in these early state contests. You haven't seen a wholesale jumping ship. In fact, he just picked up some more members of the New Hampshire legislature there's like 235,000 of them, and he's gotten some more. And he's picked up some people in Iowa. People get nervous because that's what campaigns are about. People reading polls and stories and getting nervous, but nobody's jumping ship. And so I don't think, like, if you were to look at this in terms of how voters feel about him, I think he's behind. I don't think it's dire.
Yeah.
But as a campaign consultant once told me, I don't believe in timing and lanes. I want to be winning every single day. Every day, it's my goal to win, up until and including the day of the election, not just the day of the election. So, he's not where he wants to be. The changes that they're making make that plainly evident. But I don't think he's in free fall where voters are in the early states.
We had a question. Cut you off for a second. We had a question from a viewer that I just wanted to answer because I think it actually maybe helps us pivot to another part of the conversation I wanted to hit, which is that if Trump is convicted, does that stop him from serving as president? It does not. There are no criminal convictions that disqualify you from the office of presidency. So I kind of halfway suspect that getting convicted, at least on some of those charges, might help him for the same reason that his numbers went up when he got indicted. When you're sort of running on a persecution complex, the more bad things happen to you, the better, right?
I was asking Democrats, as I was asking them about what their plan was, I was asking them about this. Like, what does the boost that Trump is getting in the primary, does that help him in the general election? They didn't think so. And this wasn't just rah-rah Democratic, cheerleading. The folks that I talked with said, you can see it in focus groups, and you can see it as you analyze the people that will decide the election, right? Independent voters in swing states. So that's independent voters, usually suburbanites, usually a little more educated, and a little higher income than average, in Michigan, in Georgia, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania. We know the states, we know which states are now swing states. And that those voters, they're lost in terms of on the persecution complex, in terms of the I'm being pilloried. Here's where they say that could help Donald Trump, the getting convicted, or even just the prosecution, even just the issue of him being under indictment and prosecuted, which is the fears of Democrats all over Washington and elsewhere, which is third-party challenges. And particularly this no labels group, which is a centrist group that's been around for, I was writing about them a decade ago plus. And they're trying to field a third-party independent candidacy. They're likely to get ballot access in every state. That's something that concerns Democrats because, as they said, if Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, who is a no labels board member and did an event and said he's not going to run for president, but who knows, Joe Manchin is not pulling votes away from Donald Trump. Yeah. He's pulling votes away from Joe Biden. That's their fear. So if you
Joe Manchin runs and Donald Trump wins, he's going to have to move to North Korea.
No, he'll just stay in West Virginia. He'll be very popular there, where he's from. He's just reelected West Virginia's favorite president.
Yeah. Is there anyone else that we need to talk about right now in the Republican field? I depressingly sort of think that maybe there's not. Has there been any movement in the polls for anybody, any ups or downs that are worth noting? Or is it just like the Republican Party itself, a picture of complacent stagnation?
Drucker, you take that one.
Well, there have been hints of some movement that I can't decide if it's consequential or not. There have been some polls there. Okay, let's go from the bottom up here. There's been one poll in New Hampshire showing Chris Christie at 10%. Somewhat interesting. There have been some polls in various states showing Tim Scott, the South Carolina senator, doing better than he was doing when he got into the race. There have been some polls, and here there's been a little bit more consistency showing Vivek Ramaswamy, the Columbus, Ohio businessman, very wealthy, 37 years old, making a move. And of course, his plan to win is to be more Trump than Trump, except on the indictment stuff. There, he doesn't have any plans to get indicted. But other than that, it's been real. I mean, who knows? I should have. Well, I saw him last week, and I mean, the one thing I'll say about Vivek, he's a very gracious candidate when it comes to reporters, and then he takes all questions, and he's always on the record. So I should be nice to him for that reason. But I should have asked him that question. But he thinks he's a more authentic version of America First than is Trump, and he thinks eventually that wins the day. But I should have asked him if he had any plans to get indicted, just to boost his numbers some more.
You should have asked him if the fact that he's not indicted is hurting his campaign for the
or disqualifying.
Is disqualifying, right?
Yeah, but he's actually. I will.
There's something reassuring about the goodness of America that, other than Donald Trump, the bearer of the America First message is someone called Ramaswamy.
Yeah. Anyway, he's actually made some moves in some state and national polls to the point where he's now in the top 5 consistently, nationally, definitely on the debate stage. And he's willing to spend 150 million of his own money to win the primary, or more. So you got to keep an eye on him. But other than that, it's been a pack of candidates all trying to break out of their pack and become this sort of consensus alternative to Trump. They're smart enough to know, at least this time around, they can't ignore Trump until that happens, because then it'll be too late. So they're all swinging at Trump in various ways, which is, something you need to, it may not work, but it's the only thing that will work, but they're not there yet.
You're betting your own money on it today. Who wins the election? Who's the next president? If you're betting your own money on it. And a substantial sum.
This is evil, Kevin, for you to do this, because
you mean if I had to, if you put a gun to my head, or
I'm you got to bet your home equity.
If I'm betting my home equity, then can't I sit this one out? I mean, I don't want to.
I'll take a Drucker.
I'd go with the incumbent. Look, I'd go with the incumbent at this point.
Yep. As would I. I would say Biden has the best chance at the moment.
Yeah. And why do you think that?
I agree with Drucker. He's the incumbent. I think I said this on a Dispatch podcast recently, that I think actually the sort of fundamentals of the economy are a little better than they seem. And as long as it doesn't seem like it's as bad as it was for Biden, which it was really bad with inflation at the beginning of his term, as long as it feels a little better than that, that's a good sign. And he could be running against Donald Trump. Yeah. And I don't think he wins against, or I don't think Donald Trump can win against Joe Biden.
I think that if the Republican primary were held only among Dispatch members, I think the nominee would be Tim Scott. Almost certainly. Seems to be a lot of love for Tim Scott out there. And I'm a little bit surprised that it hasn't translated into a better position nationally for all sorts of reasons. Any closing remarks? Any things we should be thinking about for the next week as things go on? Any interesting stories you want to flag to look at that are coming out later in the week?
Can I say, not to launch us into next week, but just to respond to what you just said about Tim Scott, Kevin, it's a test, I think, of, I know what our Dispatch members are, what their views are, or what their sort of impulses are on these things. But I think it's a bit out of step with where the Republican Party is right now. And Tim Scott offers inspiration. He offers a really uplifting personal story. And I saw it when he launched his campaign in North Charleston, South Carolina. It was a great campaign launch. And I think perhaps his so far inability to break out suggests that the party faithful, the real Republicans who vote in these primaries, just start looking for that. It's a different party than the party that elected Reagan twice.
Yeah, I think that party has ceased to exist and hasn't been there for a while. They've still got the bank account and the stationery, but some of the office space, but not
That's
much.
a real down note to end this broadcast on, right?
Well, I had a whole worse screed, but I'm not going to go into it. Maybe I'll write it up. Guys, thank you very much. And to all of you who have tuned in, an expression we still use in spite of the fact that no one has tuned anything into any kind of broadcast in 70 years now or something like that. We appreciate you all joining us for the conversation. We are deeply grateful for all of our dispatch members. Please do help spread the word. Buy people gift subscriptions, whatnot, twist their arms, tell them to not be deadbeats. And thank you all so much for your support. We really do appreciate it. And guys, thank you for being here. And everyone else, thank you all for being here as well. We'll see you next week. We'll stare awkwardly.